Welcome to Ideal Space's first podcast, where we will be exploring the theme, What is Space? I'm joined today by the founder of Ideal Space's working group, Ulrich Gehmann, and Michael Johannson, who leads new developments and digital design at Ideal Spaces. This podcast is the first in a series of 10 vignettes, in which we will be discussing the driving forces behind society as it is today. Not only the built architectural world we live in, but also the human processes of social imagination that architecture is an expression of. My name is Flora Lockridge. I will be mediating today's discussion. I graduated last year from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London with a Master's in the History of Art, and also hold a BA Honours in German and English Literature from Durham University. I joined Ideal Space's working group in 2019 to pursue my research interest in the complex, multifaceted relationship between people and space. I'm now going to introduce my co-hosts, Ulrich and Michael. After humanist education, Ulrich studied biology and anthropology at the universities of Zurich, Tübingen, and Freiburg, and business administration at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. He has worked internationally in industry and governmental consultancy, spending 2 years in Romania as a management consulting director. Having lectured for 7 years in business administration, Ulrich studied history at the University of Karlsruhe, Germany, before founding Ideal Spaces Working Group, which exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2016 and at the Shusev State Museum of Architecture in Moscow earlier this year. Michael is an artist and researcher born in Sweden and educated at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Denmark. For most of his professional life, Michael has worked in the field of space and spatial creation, gaining new perspectives whilst living abroad in China from 2007 to 2014. As Associate Professor in Digital Media at Kristianstad University, and as an independent artist, Michael strives to maintain a close relationship with the material he uses to investigate and execute ideas he finds interesting. First of all, Ulrich and Michael, as we've just heard, you come from very different professional backgrounds, but share a mutual interest in space, and specifically, ideal space. Ulrich, I wondered what got you interested in ideal spaces. And could you perhaps also briefly explain the thinking behind setting up Ideal Spaces Working Group?
The Ideal Spaces Working Group is a group composed of many different experts from different fields, from many different countries. This was unwillingly, it was not programmed, but it very much helped to further develop the Ideal Spaces general topic under different perspectives. We have architects, historians, computer experts, 3D designing experts, and so on. And the major concern about ideal spaces is the ideal about it. This has to be explained a little bit. Space, either physically present or existing as an immaterial space of an imagination or an organization humans are part of, it is an ubiquitous entity, a very basic condition to live in. We all live in spaces. They surround us as a built environment, as various modes of being socially organized. They surround us and we are part of them in our free time as well as in our work. Space is everywhere, and therefore normally we treat space either in very, very abstract academic terms, as following the tradition of Immanuel Kant that space is no real entity, or we take space for granted. We do not think about it. It's an unthought known for us that we are living in spaces, which is not true, We have to conceive space, an ideal space, in its wider terms. An ideal space is originating from the Greek words of idea and eidos, and both mean image in the sense of imagination. And then an ideal space is a one imagined as well as a one conceived as a perfect or even utopian space. This is our common notion of the ideal, something perfected, something not to be tackled any longer. And this goes in a direction of utopia. An ideal space, this is a very important point, is a space made. It's a space not evolved, it's a space constructed. No matter its kind, ideal space is a question of a made, planned order. And this is another concept to be tackled in a later podcast in our vignettes, what kind of order they are. But for the time being, it is important to see this always in the background. That an ideal space is constructed, it follows also some ideas about right space, about right human living, and hence it follows ideas, no matter if they are conscious or not, about the conditio humana, a general human condition that has to be improved by the space in question.
What I want to add to that is that we're also interested of the space of spatial creation, of the tools and methods and processes used in construction and imagining space, and especially today through computers.
Yeah, this is an important point, and this leads me to an additional important point of architecture. If we conceive space as an architectural outcome, and if we conceive architecture as not only as applying to the visible physical space, the built physical space, but also to imagine invisible architectures, for instance, the architectures of networks we do not see, as in internet spaces, or the architectures of human organizations. For instance, a large international company has an architecture and it has an organization space, even if you do not see it as a member of this organization. It will guide you, it will mold you, it will influence you in manifold ways. And this is a so-called, it's an immaterial, invisible space, but it shapes realities too, as it does physical space.
Michael, could you tell us a bit more about your experience with technology and how that's influenced your impression and understanding of space?
Making this invisible space present in a way, we have worked very much through having the visitor, the audience, being able to interact with space. We have talked about it as having the visitor configuring space, and in that way understanding how space through technology can be constructed. And not to say that it should be constructed through especially the technology we use, but giving insights on how technology also make things possible, but also how it limits what can be expressed and what kind of parameters you are allowed to have an influence on. And I think that has to do with what are we allowed to do. It's there to, as Ulrich said, to do something with us, to format us, to make us behave in a way. And with all the ideal spaces we have explored through the years, this is very much a fact that it tries to change the people that lives in these environments. As also the tools of expression changes and influence what can be expressed.
And I think it's very interesting to see how these kind of tools of expression play out in artworks and installations we see in today's galleries and museums, which are so incredibly wide-reaching and diverse. And Ideal Spaces recently exhibited in Moscow at the Shyazov State Museum of Architecture with an exhibition on community and place. Could you both maybe tell me a little bit more about how the group considered space in the virtual worlds created there?
Okay. Yeah, the basic idea was from a novel, a science fiction novel from Ray Bradbury, The Illustrated Man. Ray Bradbury, wandering through the countryside, meets a man over and over with tattoos. And he asks the man, what is going on here? Why you did it? He said, he was cursed by witchcraft. Each of these tattoos, by a closer look, starts to become alive. No? And then each of these groups becoming alive tells a different tale, playing in a different world. And this was the basic idea adopted to the Moscow exhibition. We had a large tapestry. It was placed in an oval 16 meters long and 1 meter 70 high. And now imagine, as in medieval gobelins or as in fresco paintings, you have a kind of alive gobelin. When you approach, as a visitor, when you approach the gobelin, it starts to live at certain places, at the places you are looking at. And we had devices where, for interactivity, where the visitors could put their hands on, and then out of this gobelin, out of this world, of this entire world of the gobelin, an additional world was springing up. The world we showed related to the theme of community and place. The first world we had was Centre Mondial. This was a beautiful utopian city for international peace and international understanding, designed for the cooperation of different nations in sports, in arts, in science. A closed world, completely planned and imaginable as a complete city world. This was the first one. And then we continued with, we called it Terrace World. This was a world, a fictive world. It could be placed anywhere, resting on two terraces, on two layers of terraces, as 2 stories. And on each of these terraces, a different community can develop after some time, developing its own culture with its own architecture, its own living habits. We had urban gardenings there, we had fountains there. The people could mold their terraces as they wanted. And so after some time, you have different cultures located on the different terraces. And theoretically, a visitor of this world could, wandering from one end of this world to the other end of this world, visiting different cultures on different terraces. This was the second world. The third world was based on a real utopia located in the Dolomiti Alps, in the near of the village of Borca di Cadore. It's in the middle of nowhere, and in the eastern Dolomites. But it was a really made part-time utopia. It was a central building as an assembly hall surrounded by huts where people can live in, and a school for children. And for a part of the year, the people could come here, and their children have been trained in the schools. And this was a really built utopia in the mountains. And this we contrasted with an utopia in the plain. Here we cooperated with Federico del Rosso, a Milanese architect, who developed triangled elements for building up houses and more complex buildings, like community buildings, groups of houses. You could build even an entire city out of these triangles. And these triangles were located in the plain opposite to the mountains. And then we had these 2 worlds, mountain and plain, and we called it Mountain World. And these 3 worlds were coming out on the tapestry when they have been elicited, when the visitor brought them to life. And then they started to live as the tattoos in the illustrated man.
I'm really interested in this idea of interacting with an artwork, as you just mentioned. I wondered if you could tell us, Michael, about how you found audiences have interacted with the artworks you've created in exhibitions.
Yes, I can. This mostly will refer to an article I recently wrote with some colleagues called World Making, Designing for Audience Participation, Immersion and Interaction in Virtual and Real Spaces. So, as an artist, you often try to open up new experience for people, challenging them to extend horizons and perceptions. This becomes particularly relevant when thinking about experiencing and interacting with virtual created environments and in an exhibition setting. In this work I have been involved in, we have returned to the idea that if we want to have an audience or visitor experience 3D spaces of different sorts in an exhibition format, we need to find ways for the visitor to enter, interact, and experience these virtual worlds without too much formal knowledge how to enter, navigate, and perceive them, in order to have the visitor feel both present and immersed by them. And this we often do by having the visitor also interact with parts or the whole exhibition itself. Because there is always a risk with new, not seen and experienced technologies, that we have the visitor exploring the technology itself instead, rather than the topic of our intention, in general, the notion of space and spatial constructions. Through this work, we have gained knowledge that many forms of interaction takes hours of practice to learn and even longer to master, and therefore are not fit for the use directly in an exhibition, but valuable tools for us as artists, designers, and technicians to help us create things that have not existed. In this line of work, we have learned that configuring space via user participation and interaction is not easy, but crucial for an immersed experience to take place, and also for the audience to spend time in that part of the exhibition, because the attention span is quite low. We measure this during the 2016 exhibition, and people stay in that space for about 90 seconds, and that is not much if you have a lot to tell. So how can you capture the attention of the visitors and have them stay, explore, interact, and experience the things that you want to communicate? So throughout our work developing methods and tools and processes, we try to emphasize the importance of a multi-perspective view of space and its entities, based on the idea to transcend merely scientific or artistic approaches into a more comprehensive and immediate approach and working practice, in which we try to use different forms of interaction and telepresence to create a state of immersion. This relates to our idea about notion of space. It is about symbolic objects and entities, the issue of gestalt, of course, not about mere construction and functions. To have the creative worlds to stand out to something believable, the issue of representation, and how we through thoughtfully designed user interaction can create an immersed experience for the visitor. Developing through iteration is common practice in many art design disciplines, and also for our type of work, in which we strive to facilitate an openness to what's happened in between the design cycle, to challenge the machine and software logic and our own limits and conventions to produce something that is both unexpected and valuable, and in the end will point out possible new direction. So using this loop switching between the state of editing, tweaking the parameters, and the experience being there, help us develop and put forward qualities that sometimes is produced by errors and wrongdoings that are hidden from the concept's point of view, and by doing so, have the concept redeveloped itself through the results and experiences we achieve by iteration. This we have worked with for many years, started in the late 90s when we used the Half-Life engine to explore future office spaces, amongst others. We also explore different moods in space. And going in between the editor and the experience is very crucial, and a setup we have used, and I have used many times, because it gives this short time span in between editing and experience. So you can actually all the time have some kind of idea what you are designing. So this short iteration between editing and experience is crucial for my way of working. And of course, this also relates trying out different kind of interaction models with visitor in mind. So when we do this, we do not formulate any detailed specification in relation to the concept beforehand, or rather loosely, not photoreal or do not use textures. But at the same time, it is important for us to be able to control, or at least understand, the in and outputs of the development environment itself, from bits to spaces. So we also see the shortcomings and the errors and quirks as vital resources that suddenly can reveal themselves as major features with specific qualities. When trying to follow the design intention or concept, the material method and prototypes themselves, and when we are bending them, can produce qualities not known beforehand. In our line of work, for this to happen, the production needs to reach a certain state of complexity, to be able for all of the possible parameters to be explored thoroughly and have an impact on the details as well as the whole. And of course, for the whole design team or the work group, this is also important, because since we are having a short amount of time between editing and experience, most people in the project will know what we are creating and have the same idea of what's in the pipeline. So therefore, a production environment itself is crucial to facilitate practice-based research in the area of art and design, where one can game the rules of play. Otherwise, there is a risk that art design projects are just illustrations of technology, and technology-driven projects unreflected use conventions and qualities from art. And from me, who work in academia, I find it very stimulating to work with real exhibition, having a real audience, because that takes me out of the constructed or the artificial environment of the university. And it's strengthened my possibility to work with things that will both surprise me and strengthen my imagination. In the work I have done with the ID Space Working Group, we have focused mostly on historical and maybe not always realized buildings, more ideas about ideal societies or ideal spaces. And the interest there for me is that most of them only exist. They don't exist as real buildings, and they exist as drawings or maybe scale models, for example. So the spaces you can experience in relation to them is sort of in a distance from them.
I realized it while Michael spoke. Very interesting point is fascination about historical spaces, which are in fact future spaces, because we have to imagine them in a positive way, like in science fiction. And this was exactly my driving motor for being interested in spaces at all. Very irrational, very unscientific, just fascination in experiencing spaces. Since I'm 15, also how the Aztec capital city looked like, or Babylon, or it's great. No? And,
I underneath in my family house, I recreated the moon base alpha scenery in cardboard. And I used magnetics to move characters around in that. I built solar panels and of course you explore these things you don't know anything about as a consequence of that curiosity. And you start imagining, why should this be put there, and how is that constructed, and so on. So from just copying, you entering a world of science that you try to rediscover and reinvent and understand.
I think it's a very important point behind this fascination. The Greek says philosophy starts with wondering, with being curious, and all kind of philosophy. And I remember until I was 15, I was purely fascinated without any scientific behavior or questioning behind it. I have seen images, reconstructions from old Babylon. If you see these palm trees and these blue glazed tiles and these strange ziggurat buildings, these temple towers, it could have been on any planet in any solar system inhabited by another species than humans. You know, and this was bloody fascinating for me. Also in science fiction, also when as you had it, as these NASA constructions from the 60s, for instance, fascinating, how the cities look like, how a settlement on another planet looks like, and so on.
Yeah. And how do we as humans adapt to this constructed environment where the conditions are different? For example, gravity, a simple example, but that has some real consequences in relation to our bodily construction.
Yes, I mean, I've done some research as well on the 1927 film by Fritz Lang, Metropolis, and what I haven't quite realised, revisiting this idea of us feeling, you know, watching a film or feeling like you're immersed in an artwork or the moving image, and I hadn't realised that a lot of the futuristic, the set there, is actually based on architectural drawings that have been blown up, or small-scale models that have been enlarged and digitally, so that we feel like we are there, kind of in the world of Metropolis. I do think it's fascinating how artwork can really draw us into and change our thinking about being in space.
Yeah, and I think the space of, for example, computer games also trigger people today, where you actually are inside of very strange worlds and you get experiences from them.
Yes, and absolutely, and that's why also those kind of games can sometimes be quite dangerous, right? There's a lot of research done on, you know, children, you know, obsessively kind of playing on these games and being kind of sucked into a world. But it goes to show how powerful it can be, an experience of playing this game.
Yeah, this leads to another aspect for me of a general character, also underlying Michael and my work and our research on form and gestalt, on morphology of spaces and on atmosphere, what they convey, what overall impression. The spaces we wanted to show in our exhibitions, the spaces we wanted to show have to be conceived as parts of a world. And this is the matter of style, stil. You can imagine any. The spaces we presented were designed to trigger imagination on behalf of the audience, of the visitor. You have to look and you have to consult your imagination when you see at our spaces, and you have to imagine that the rest of the world you do not see now is of the same style. It is of the same habit, like this Fritz Lang example. If you are in a part of Metropolis, you can imagine the rest of this world is of the very same style as the part you are in a visible space for you now, for instance, on one of these roads in Metropolis or so. And on the other hand, it are ideas, imaginations, also molding and making spaces. And this is a crucial point as regards the ideal on the ideal space. Finally, these spaces we are trying to recover, remodel, to reinvent even, finally they are imaginations. We have an imagination about space, about the ideal architecture in the end, which is the ideal organization in terms of decisive utopian spaces. And then we build a space according to ideas. So it's a mutual process. This is very interesting. On the one hand, as a space leads to imagination, leads to ideas, and molds and forms people, as their social behavior, and so on and so on. On the other hand, it are ideas which lead to spaces.
But this imagination also have some conventions, and the convention also of the technology that lends itself visualizing these imagined worlds. There is, for example, now a very interesting discussion going on that why use camera effects in computer games? Because there is no camera. In virtual worlds, there is, of course, the metaphor of a camera, but it's not constructed as a camera. It's just an area in which you look inside of a virtual world. But to make that believable, we lend the convention of a camera to that virtual space. So we actually see the virtual space through the convention of the mechanical camera. And now there is this discussion, why not use actually the technology in itself? Skip the camera, it's not there anymore. People now are so familiar with virtual spaces. We don't need the convention of the mechanical camera to make this believable. And I think this is actually shaping what kind of new virtual worlds that will come out and how they are going to be experienced if we just skip the idea of the mechanical camera and all of that shortcomings that comes with that. But I think until now that those worlds, skipping that, people don't believe in them. They have no believability. And for me, that is crucial. No matter what, if I try to reconstruct something or make something completely new, it has to be believable in some way. This contract between the audience and the creator, they must feel that they're actually stepping into a world that they can believe in. There is no meta in that sense.
I think this is a crucial point also as regards our work made so far, in particular in the exhibitions. We deliberately tried not to make photorealistic worlds, but believable spaces standing for a world. This was this matter of style, and this refers also to the very meaning of a symbol. In modernity, the symbol was often misunderstood as a mere representation of something. A symbol is a full representative of something. The space we presented is standing for a world of the same or of comparable kind. This was this point with the style. And first of all, it has to be a believable space in order to imagine a believable world. This space we see now is a part of. Believability is crucial. And related to believability, this was one aspect for us, for Michael and my research, was the notion of gestalt, of proportion, of measurement, of morphologies. And the other is the point of atmosphere. These spaces need some atmosphere. For instance, if you look at a very well done 17th century landscape painting, it is a landscape that does nowhere exist on this planet, but it is believable. You can feel, when you look at the image on this painting, you can feel that you will become a part of this world. As in case of the tapestry in Moscow, you will become part of this world. You can, as if you could walk around. As Michael said it, you do not need no camera moves or so. You are just in this world.
And I really like these paintings where the artist have paid as much attention to every stroke he or she have made. Nothing is in the center. Everything is important. And that's exactly. I think, is how you create believable things. That you don't put anything into the center. You pay attention to the whole in that sense.
And this whole is an aspect, it will recur in one of our vignettes. This whole is about gestalt, about morphology, and finally about human measure. But this is a later vignette. I just wanted to indicate it, since we are speaking about it now, and our vignettes are also composing a whole. It's different topics, cannot be isolated from each other, as you cannot divide space into little fragments. Space is a whole, the worlds are a whole, And our topics in the vignettes are also a whole, finally.
So I could take a very practical example I'm working at the moment, and that is we have a building that is in the idea of that building, it's 1,100 meters high. And there are not many buildings that are 1,100 meters high today. So it cannot be experienced in that. I cannot go anywhere to have a look at such building, to get an idea how that scale of a building is experienced through my presence in its close by that building. But when we do that try to reconstruct that in 3D and show it in an exhibition, it's really hard to, how do you communicate a 1,100 meters high building? We don't know. We don't know. And so it's very much trial and error. So we get the imagined feeling of being in the presence of a building in that size. 1,100 meters doesn't tell us anything. We can imagine it as an entity, but how can that entity be experienced in a way that it tells something about that it is 1,100 meters, not in its measurement, but through its presence.
I imagine the reference. Also, we did this world. Michael, first of all, did this world. It was called Babel 2D. This was a futurist utopian space for new human beings. Finally, as in every good utopia. But this 1,100 meters is a pointer. Nobody can imagine this, and the sheer measure, the indication of the measure, this is 1,100 or 1,000 meter or whatever, does not help anything as regards imagination. And imagination is important to have a conception as a human being in what kind of space and world I am. And this is an interesting point, in particular with modernist architecture, the complete neglection of the human measure as reference.
Listening to you speaking there has reminded me of several different artworks. Firstly, Michael, when you were talking about the camera being removed altogether, I immediately thought of the 1920s, where artists like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Hans Richter, and Pablo Picasso were exploring the photogram as a new artistic medium. That was where the camera was removed, and objects they wanted to depict were just placed quite simply on photosensitive paper and then taken away again after a few hours after it being exposed to sunlight. And you'd get then an image there of the object that seemed quite photographic, but was also quite uncanny, because you'd get these silhouettes of objects that had literally just been there a few moments before, but were no longer there. And I think this idea of seeing only a trace of an object rather than the object itself really forces the viewer to believe and use his imagination to put the pieces back together of the puzzle and work out what was there. And I find that very interesting. And then the second artwork I was thinking of is a work by Childo Moreles, who's a Brazilian artist. It's currently exhibited at the Tate Modern in London, and it's called Babel. It's a large-scale sculptural installation which was made in 2001, and it takes the form of this circular tower, a couple of meters tall, and it's made up of hundreds of second-hand analog radios. And as you stand there looking upwards, you can see the progression of these radios through the ages. There are old 1920s models at the bottom, and then towards the top, they become much more contemporary. And you really imagine this tower going up and up endlessly into the sky. And it reminded me, Michael, of the 1,100 meter tall building you're exploring in your current project. Because again, due to the limited space within the gallery, Moreles, of course, couldn't create a tower that was as tall as he perhaps intended. So instead, the viewer has to imagine the tower growing taller. He also creates an immersive experience to help the viewer imagine this futuristic world of Babel. So the room is dark, it's flooded with blue light, and the radios are also tuned into different frequencies, so you get this cacophony of noises in the space. So Morella's really does pay attention to the space as a whole to allow the audience to step into a world they can truly believe in. What I wondered now to steer the discussion in a slightly different direction is actually, I suppose, related to the strange, unprecedented circumstances we find ourselves in today, which in a way take away any kind of imagination from our experience of space. I should add that we're recording today from 3 different countries, the UK, Germany and Sweden, countries that have managed and experienced the COVID-19 pandemic in very different ways. But one thing I think we have all experienced is how spaces have changed dramatically with new social distancing measures. So meeting friends, shopping, going to the restaurant, everyday activities that we once took for granted have now turned into significant events, if you like. And we consciously have to follow rules and how we interact with other people, and our movements within spaces become quite limited. And that takes us away from kind of any kind of imagination that we might have with spaces and exploring them. I wondered what your thoughts are on experiences today with space and also this kind of social dimension of space.
That is an interesting point. Michael has some very, very interesting research findings on that. And upfront, if we look at one basic line, that it are also ideas that create spaces, as well as spaces generate a certain sociality, a certain imagination. This point of the loss of imagination, one could be a bit provocative and say, and this is well in line with one Occidental general tendency of development over centuries. This is the desire for an increased abstraction. It started with the Gothic cathedral and it ends with the internet spaces of today. These lines of development, there's a French historian school called Annales. They say there are tendencies of a longue durée, of a long duration. And this tendency for abstraction led to a loss of imagination in the final, as a hypothesis. And this is one aspect. And COVID-19, seen from this background, is just at the peak of the iceberg, nothing else.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. And how have you experienced it, Michael?
I would say I come well prepared because over the last 10 years, I've been conducting my teaching only online. So for me, in the everyday, nothing has changed for me in that sense. So I'm still in my common work environment. I meet my students online. I have done that for 10 years now. I go to my studio. I meet some other artists that is in that space, of course. I still meet them, but we have our separate studios. So it's very easy managed, although we have some restrictions also here in Sweden, but they are voluntary in many ways.
Well, I suppose in a way with online teaching, you could also say that it forces people to use their imagination because, you don't have the kind of physical presence. You're not allowed to or you can't, bring in objects and material to help while sitting next to
Absolutely. And we have worked with, since I'm teaching at a design school, we have deliberately tried to bring the design studio online. So we have also studio-based teaching online.
Yes, I mean, and also Ulrich and I recently presented a paper at a conference online that was meant to take place in or near Canterbury Cathedral. And it completely changes the dynamic. I don't know how you found it, Ulrich, but I found it almost shame in a way to be talking about, history and heritage, but to be sitting, behind a computer screen.
Yeah. This is coining. It is a good example. It is even allegoric, this example. And it has to do also with what we addressed as believable space, experience of spaces. It would have been better if we both at least would have seen the interior and exterior of this beautiful cathedral as an experienced space, and to experience an audience listening to us and people you can really speak with as physical persons. This is a completely different dimension, and it's richer in my eyes of experience than this technically directed experience. It was a bit strange to speak about abstraction in a pure abstract means in a pure abstract conference. This is that. It was a new experience for me, but not a good one. As regards the topics we discussed so far, so imagination, experiencing space, and believability. And the interesting point is our theme also. So the topic of Flora and me was about abstraction, and the title of our presentation was the Gothic Cathedral and Abstraction, in order to line out this longue durée mention. But when you realize when you experience that all this took place, this abstraction already, that we have become detached in a large degree to every direct experience. This is really strange. Lots of imagination.
And then you are sort of limited to that format of communication, which filters out a lot of things that does exist in the physical environment and in the physical presence of other people. I was on a conference Monday and Tuesday this week in Mallorca in Spain. I was not there, but it was virtual and I presented my paper and so on, but I didn't bump into anyone. And I think that is the interesting thing going to a conference, that you actually meet people you don't know. You have never seen them before, and you make connections through your common interest or arguments and whatever. And this did not occur in that virtual form. They had tried to facilitate it through a lot of chats, chat rooms, and so on, but there was no interaction. And the conference hall was always empty.
Interesting.
And I think what you are saying here, Flora, that what happens if we are not forced, but if the only technology we can use limits our way to express ourselves and communicate with other people, that is not a very good development. When we today talk about the notion of space, because we are trapped in the metaphors of the computer space, the
Very
office, the desktop, all these things that we have learned from the physical world. And now it helps us building a sort of a communication regulated prison for us to exist in. With no openness. Everything is in order and regulated. And it's extremely boring.
This is the very point of managed spaces to come in our next podcast, and what we addressed already and what Michael addressed already, first of all, about a format. We are living in formatted times, and we are living a mediated life. And the question is if a mediated life is worth the name.
Great. So I think that sums up our discussion on space very nicely. Thank you, Ulrich and Michael, for sharing your thoughts about ideal spaces and notions of space. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do check out our website, idealspaces.org, and Instagram page @idealspaceswg, where we upload new material and ideas every day. We will be continuing to talk about space in future podcasts. To give a brief overview of our vignettes, themes will include curiosity, world-making, gestalt, notion of space, systematics, configuring space, functionalised space, managed space, formatisation and imagination. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.